Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We are on chapter 1, verse 9. We're in the middle of the Ramban. The Ramban is discussing what would be the idea of korbanos anyway. Why should it be that I take an animal, I slaughter it on the altar, and now I'm closer to God? So he cited the Rambam. The Rambam says there were various nations of the time who worshipped animals. So what we're saying is we kill these alleged deities in our service of God. So the Ramban, we saw one question from the Ramban, which basically is, so we're going to define our concept of how to come close to God based on what crazy things other people are doing. It's the Torah describes a korban as bringing nachas ruach LaHashem, reach lichoach LaHashem, excuse me, this pleasing scent before God, and it's pleasing because we're showing that the Meshuganas are wrong. Like that's the best we can do. That's one point he raises. Around the middle of the Ramban, in mine, it's a new paragraph. It begins with V'hinei Noach. This is a very compelling question. V'hinei Noach b'tzeiso min ha'teva im shloshes banav ein ba'olam kastio mitzri. How do you understand Noach's bringing sacrifices of animals when he gets off the ark? There was no such thing as an Egyptian at the time. Hikriv korban. He brought an offering. Vayita be'enei Hashem. That was good in the eyes of God, and it says in the pasuk that God smelled the fine scent. It says that God is so touched by, so moved by Noach's offering. He says, I'm not going to curse man anymore. Earlier than Noach, Hevel. From the story of Cain and Abel, Cain and Hevel brings from the best of his animals, and God is happy. There was no such thing as avodah zarah at the time. Idol worship. A very interesting proof from Bilam. We know that Bilam, who wants to curse the Jewish people, brings offerings to sort of get on God's good side, however you understand all of that. But what's he saying? Is he saying, I bet all those idol worshippers are ridiculous? That's presumably not the idea of what Bilam is doing. What Bilam is saying is that his message is that he wants to come close to God. The lashon hakarbanos is korbani lachmi lishai reach lichochiv chalila shloye bem shum toeles v'ratzon rak sholos avodah zarah midas hashotim. So again, the Ramban repeats this thing that we look at korbanos as being a way to come close to God. It's all about that we're not like other people. What's this about? V'yoser roy lishma tam she'omrim bohem ki bavur shemasei b'nei adam nigmarim b'machshava. He says, what I really think the pshat is that actions of people are completed based on thought, speech, and deed. Tziva Hashem, ki kasher yechta yavi korban. So God instructs that when a person sins, of course, korbanos are not only brought for sins, but this is one of the classic things that korbanos are brought for. When a person sins, he should bring a sacrifice. Yismoch yadav alav, keneged hama'aseh. He should take his hands and place his hands on the animal, and that represents sinful act. V'yisvade b'fiv, and a person should enunciate the sin that he did and confess it. Keneged hadibur, and that represents speech, sinful speech. V'yisrof bo'esh hakerev v'kloyos shehem kleya machshav v'atava, and he burns the innards and the kidneys of the animal, because these things are associated with desire and thought. And the legs represent the hands and feet of a person that does work. And the person takes the blood from the animal and casts it on the altar, and that represents his own blood, his own soul. So that a person should think when he does all of this, by doing all of these actions, both act and speech, But by doing all these things to various parts of the animal's body, a person is reflecting that he sinned against his God in his body and in his soul. V'roi lo sheyishboch domo, v'yisrof gufo. His blood should be cast on the altar. His body should be burnt on the altar. Lule chesed habore, if not for the kindness of God. Shalakach menu tmura, v'chiper hakorban hazeh, sheyeh damo tachas damo. God creates a model that there's another way to connect to him. There's another way to get the atonement, that we say the animal is taking my place. Nefesh tachas nefesh, soul for a soul. V'rashei vorei korban can get rashei vorav. The limbs of the korban of the animal to parallel my limbs. V'amanos lahachios behen morei haTorah sheyispalelu alav. And by the way, there are parts of the animal that he brings to the Kohanim. The Kohanim should eat. The idea is that the Kohanim should daven for him. Okay, this is a very interesting idea, very different than the Rambam. And basically, in a nutshell, what it really is that the idea of a korban is a person is bringing home for themselves that everything in their lives, particularly when they've sinned, is by the goodness of God, and this should be them on the altar. And it brings it home in a very powerful way. It's very humbling. You can imagine that humbling of oneself is very pleasing to God. The korban tamid, eventually natzlu harabim me chato tamid. He says, by the way, the idea of the daily offering is just that as sort of like a general merit that the Jewish people should not fall into sin. And these things really resonate. Okay. Famous dispute. Let's go on to chapter 2, verse 1. Chapter 2, verse 1. B'nefesh ki sakriv korban mincha la'Hashem. When a soul brings a mincha offering, this is a voluntary offering to God, so les yeh korbano. The offering should be flour. V'yotzak alei shemen, you should pour out an oil. V'nosan alei levona, he places on a frankincense. This language of a soul that brings an offering to God is very striking. There's a very famous Rashi on this. If you look at Rashi on Pasuk Aleph, v'nefesh ki sakriv, lo namer nefesh b'chol korbanos nedava, el b'mincha. By all of the voluntary offerings, we've spoken about bringing an animal as a voluntary offering. It's a very simple offering. This is bringing flour with some oil and some frankincense. So it only talks about a soul bringing an offering by voluntary offerings in the context of this mincha offering. Mi darko lisnadev mincha. Who would be the type of person who would offer a flour offering before God? Ani, person who can't afford much, a poor person. Merkadosh Baruch Hu, God comes and says, Male ani alav kilu hikriv nafsho. This poor person who scraped together a few dollars to bring some flour. So you ostensibly would look at it and say, it's chutzpah, it's not so impressive. God says, this person who's making a real effort to bring an offering to me, in my mind, it's like he brought his own soul. It's a nice idea to think about. See the Kli Yakar on this. Kli Yakar on Pasuk Aleph. V'nefesh ki sakriv mincha. Mi darko lisnativ mincha ani. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu ma'alani anav kilu hikriv nafsho. He cites Rashi, which is really the Gemara. Mi tamza nemar parshas Tzav, matzos te'ochel v'haino lechem oni v'ani. Kikoza shayach el ha'ani. Hanichna b'teva ki isas hamatzah she'eno oles. So with that, when we talk about the mincha offering, so the flour of the mincha should generate matzos specifically, because matzos represent the poor man's bread. So it all is sort of along the same lines. And through this perspective, we can appreciate all of these korbanos. Kodem b'pasuk, kodem lavo lidei chet, Moshe Nemar, Vayishman Yishrun Vayivat. It talked about people who can afford nicer korbanos first. You could very well pose the question, if God is so excited about this offering, why doesn't he mention it first? So he says, we're actually mentioning people who are more likely to have done something that they want to bring an offering for, that they feel bad about. And who are the people who are most likely to mess up? Not the poor people. The wealthy people are most likely to mess up because it's normal when we're fat, when we have everything we want, it's very easy to become complacent. If someone has more wealth than another person or more honor than another person, their temptations, their evil inclination is stronger as well. It's a very famous pasuk later on. That when the head of a tribe sins. That's the language of the pasuk. That when the head of a tribe sins. Ki lashon asher, that language of that, mora al havadai. It connotes it's definitely going to happen. When a person is in a prominent position, they're definitely going to sin. The very fact that they're in this prominent position brings them to sin. Therefore, it spoke first about the cattle offering. We assume that the person who brought that offering is wealthy. Excuse me. Afterwards, it mentions a sheep. Because, if a person can afford it, a sheep, he's probably middle class. Then it talks about the offering of a bird. If a person's bringing a bird as an offering, that's probably they're having some problems meeting their expenses. And then it talks about, does this flour offering, the person must be poor. Therefore, it says in the context of the cow that you should wash its innards in water. Haino, kirvo shel korban, al v'kerev ish v'leiv amuk lo rochetz v'od tumaso bo ki al arov ha'osher gorim habiut umitzo aso lo rochetz. Says a very interesting, kind of chilling thing. He says that the language is we wash the innards of the animal, because when we're talking about that expensive animal, the animal's innards can be washed, but it's not so simple for the owner to cleanse himself, because it's difficult. It's challenging when you're a person of wealth. We might continue this tomorrow. I'll have to see. So we discussed the Ramban's position about what korbanos are about, and then we had Rashi, and we began the Kliyaka regarding this whole perspective about the beauty of the mincha being offered by the relatively poor person.